Welcome everyone. This is the Chapter 54 AP Biology lecture on community ecology. In 53 we talked about the way that populations interact within themselves, and in terms of a community we're looking at how populations interact with one another. We're going to look at a lot of different examples of interactions. Some interactions are beneficial to all species. You see an example here where we've got a symbiotic relationship where they are mutually beneficial. And we're going to see some interactions where one or more organism is negatively affected or unaffected by the interaction. So interspecific interactions, inter means between, so between species interactions. There are several examples. Competition, you could eat the other species. That's a pretty quick one-time interaction. Herbivory would be the same thing, but just eating plants. Parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism all get rolled under the term symbiosis. That's long-term living together and interacting. So note that positive is notated by a plus sign, negative by a minus sign, and no effect is the zero. So that's important later. So in competition, both organisms are negatively affected because you're competing over a resource. So if you're competing, then the resource must be in short supply, or you wouldn't compete for it, you would just both get it. Strong competition can lead to this competitive exclusion, which is essentially where one organism outcompetes another. Russian ecologist G.F. Gauss concluded that two species competing for the same resource cannot coexist permanently in the same place. So that makes sense. Eventually, one of the species is going to win, one of the species is going to lose, and either move on to a new place or they're going to be extirpated, where we see that local extinction. And an idea that rolls into this and helps limit competition sometimes is the idea of an ecological niche. You'll hear niche. There's another pronunciation of this word that is escaping me right now. I say niche. So an ecological niche is the sum of an organism's use of biotic and abiotic resources. Can be thought of as an organism's role. I know that some lower level teachers will teach it as like an organism's job in an ecosystem. That's often too limiting. What's a tree's job? Is it to do photosynthesis? Is it to provide a home for squirrels or owls? Or is it to fix nitrogen? What's a tree's job? Its role is a bigger picture thing than that. The example that I like to use is I have a couple of different jobs. I'm a teacher, I'm a coach, and in the summers I work construction. So I have three jobs, but I would argue that my role is improving the world around me. In two of my jobs, I'm helping students improve themselves, and in one of my jobs, I'm physically helping improve the world. So, yes, that's a way to pat myself on the back and make myself feel better about all the hard work I do. But it's also a good example. We might not just be talking about the photosynthesis that the tree is doing. We might also be talking about how it manipulates the environment in which it lives. An important aspect of ecological niches is that it allows species that are similar to coexist by dividing up resources. So here you've got a picture that shows two lizards that live in different elevations of a tree. And basically this limits competition because this lizard is going to be on a shady branch up in near the canopy. This lizard is going to be down low on a sunny surface or on a fence post or something along those lines. So these two are physically separated so they won't compete for resources. That's going to help reduce selection rates. That's going to help basically provide more niches. You reduce selection. So two species can violate that Gaussian hypothesis that said two species can't live in the same place for very long. This is one way that can happen. So a fundamental niche and a realized niche is kind of like fundamental is everywhere that the species could live. Realized is where it does live. So we often see, you see here, places where let me just show you the picture. So you're looking at a couple of barnacles here. Okay, so the realized niches are where these are actually found. I'm not going to try to pronounce this word. But this species, if you check out the bottom picture here, this is its fundamental niche. It could fill all of this area. Due to resource partitioning, these are two different species now. Due to resource partitioning, the sea barnacle takes up a smaller space, so its realized niche is much smaller. Its fundamental niche could be bigger, but it's kind of the idea that we're not going to compete for resources. You take these, I'll take these, and we can both survive. That's the kind of the strategy behind it. There are a lot of examples of this in nature. Another thing that we see is temporal partitioning of niches. Sorry, I mispronounced that. Another way to divide up resources. There are two species of spiny mice, golden spiny mice and common spiny mice. They're normally both nocturnal, which means they're active during the night, but when they're in the same place, one of them becomes diurnal, which is the opposite of nocturnal, so day active. So again, they're dividing up resources so they don't have to compete over those resources. They're in the same place, but now they're there at a different time. Character displacement basically says that when two similar species are in the same place, they look more different than those species do when they're not in the same place. So imagine two, let's look at these birds, Galapagos finches. Okay, so when this species and this species are on different locations, they look more similar. Their beak depth is roughly the same. You see the spike here and the spike here are in roughly the same spots. When they're in the same location, their beak depth gets a lot different. Fortis beak depth gets a lot bigger. Whatever this F word is, gets a lot smaller. So we end up with smaller beaks and bigger beaks. So the populations, again, are looking for ways to divide up their resources. If beak depths were middle, and you think about it in terms of evolution, there certainly are going to be some organisms that are born here in the middle, but they're going to have to compete with the other species for resources. Whereas the freaks with the really deep beaks are not going to have any competition, and the freaks with the really small or shallow beaks aren't going to have any competition for their food. Moving on to the next interaction. So that was all competition. Now we're talking exploitation. That's where one species is going to benefit by feeding on the other species. Predator-prey, herbivory, and parasitism is the symbiotic relationship where we get that positive-negative interaction. So predation is going to be one species. Predator eats the prey. There are lots of adaptations that predators and prey have developed to either be better at catching prey or be better at avoiding being caught. Many predators have claws, fangs, or poison, things along those lines. Prey have things like hiding, fleeing, and forming herds and schools. There are some really cool videos on the Discovery Channel and National Geographic that show herds of animals that would lose in a one-on-one fight with something like an alligator or something like a lion or a cheetah. And the herd, the strength in numbers argument holds true where the herd defends the individuals. And the same can be true of schools of fish and things along those lines. Also, we've got morphological and physiological defensive adaptations, like skunks and porcupines have adaptations that we're all pretty familiar with. There are some other examples. These two types of mimicry, you need to make sure you can distinguish between those two. Oh, I'm sorry. You need to make sure you can distinguish between those two. And we're going to talk more about those here in a couple of slides. Mechanical defenses are going to be like physical, like claws or spikes or something along those lines. Chemical defenses are, what they sound like. Skunk sprays to avoid being eaten. There's camouflage. There's aposematic coloration, where I look bright. I look like I'm poisonous, so I am poisonous. There's a video here about seahorse camouflage. Make sure you check that out on the lecture. Um, so here's what I talked about a little bit on the previous slide. We've got two types of mimicry, Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry. And Batesian is where an okay species looks like a poisonous species as a defense mechanism. Don't eat me because I look like that thing that's really bad for you. And then Mullerian mimicry, two dangerous species, two poisonous species, look like each other. So an example of Batesian mimicry is where a harmless species mimics a harmful one. These two look sort of kind of similar. There are also examples with coral snakes where red and black matching or red and black touching is okay, but black and yellow touching is not okay. Things like that. So it's where a safe or a non-poisonous organism looks like a poisonous organism as a defense mechanism. And then Mullerian mimicry is where two poisonous species look similar, like bees and yellow jackets. They look, hey, don't come near me, I'm dangerous. So it's just two patterns of mimicry. It's also involved in many predators to help them approach prey. Check out these pictures of this mimic octopus on the next slide. When it's hunting a sea snake, it looks like a sea snake. When it's hunting a flounder, it makes itself look like a flounder. When it's hunting a stingray, it folds itself up and makes itself look like a stingray. So mimicry isn't just something that we see in prey, we also see it in predators as well. Herbivory is going to be eating some large herbivore eats plants or algae. Large mammals are the most familiar herbivores, but most herbivores are invertebrates. So we don't spend a lot of time studying invertebrates. Hopefully, when you take college courses, you'll learn more about invertebrates. It's just not a huge part of our curriculum. Many herbivores have specialized adaptations, like different types of teeth. They have different digestive systems, like you may have heard that cows have multiple stomachs so that they can process the grass and the cellulose and things like that. And then plants can have defense mechanisms like spines or thorns. Maybe you've experienced that personally. Something like poison ivy has a defense mechanism there. There's a manatee doing what herbivores do. Parasitism is our bad symbiotic relationship. That's where one organism benefits and one is harmed. The parasite is the one that benefits, and the host is the organism that's harmed. Kind of a nitpicky kind of a thing. Endo always means inside, ecto always means outside. So endoparasites live inside the body of the host, like a tapeworm or something along those lines. Where things like fleas and ticks are ectoparasites that live on the outside of the organism. There are parasites out there that change the behavior of the host in a way that increases the likelihood that the parasite will be transmitted. I've seen some zombie theory that if a parasite could cause zombieism, and it would essentially turn the host into a zombie, and then the zombie would go bite other people, and that would allow the parasite to be spread from host to a new host. That's kind of a silly example, but there are things like that, like some viruses and some bacteria will make us sneeze to help us spread themselves around. So yeah, positive interactions are going to be mutualism and commensalism. Those are going to be two symbiotic relationships. And mutualism, everyone benefits. It's mutually beneficial. Often, the two species are completely dependent upon the other. Sometimes both species can survive alone, but sometimes they can't. Here you're seeing acacia trees and fire ants, or I'm pretty sure it's fire ants. So they both benefit from their interaction. The ants clear an area around the acacia tree so that the acacia tree gets the nutrients that it needs, and these stinging ants basically live inside this plant. They live in little pods on the plant. So